Hi, everyone. Before we start today's podcast, I wanted to tell you about QCon London 2024. Our International Software Development Conference takes place in the heart of London this April 8th to the 10th. Uncover senior practitioners' points of view on emerging trends and best practices across topics like AI software architectures, generative AI, platform engineering, and modern software security. Explore what they've learned, techniques they've discovered, and the pitfalls to avoid to validate your ideas and plans. I'll be there hosting a track on connecting systems with speakers talking about APIs, protocols, and observability. Learn more at QConLondon.com. We hope to see you there. Hello, and welcome to the InfoQ podcast. I'm Thomas Betts, and today members of the InfoQ editorial staff and I will be discussing the current trends in software architecture and design. I'll let each of them introduce themselves, and we'll start with Eran Stiller.
Hi, so everyone, my name is Eran Stiller. I'm the principal software architect for Luxury Escapes. I'm also an editor on architecture and design in InfoQ. I've been doing it for several years now, and I'm enjoying every minute. And I can't wait for this discussion, which is always very interesting.
Great. And we'll move over to Vasco.
Hello, thank you for listening. My name is Vasco Veloso. I'm currently working for ING Netherlands on a role connected to software design and architecture with a few interests along the way, but an all-encompassing and generic role at the moment.
I think we all say that. Move on to Tanmay.
Hello, everyone. This is my very first time on this podcast. I've been working as Operations Data Platform Architect for SLB. My main work goes towards architecting systems for production optimizations and well constructions in the oil and gas domain using the latest tool technologies that we're using, and while also making sure that we are reducing carbon or using the carbon neutral technologies to do so. Pretty excited to be here.
And we'll wrap up with Daniel Bryant.
Hey everyone, good to see everyone again. Daniel Bryant here. I run DevRel at Ambassador Labs, but a long career in software architecture, and I do moonlight as a solution architect at Ambassador Labs as well. You may recognize the voice. I do a few podcasts alongside Thomas and also do the news management here at InfoQ too. So looking forward to this discussion.
So as I said, today we'll be discussing the current trends in architecture and design as part of the process to create our annual trends report for InfoQ. Those reports provide the InfoQ readers with a high-level overview of the topics to pay attention to and also help us, the editorial team, focus on innovative technologies for our reporting. In addition to the report and the trends graph that are available on InfoQ.com, this podcast is a chance to hear our conversation and some of the stories that our expert practitioners have observed. I think we want to start the conversation today with design for portability and the concept of cloud-bound applications, which has been gaining adoption. One of the popular frameworks for this is Dapper. That's D-A-P-R, not confused with Dapper, D-A-P-P-E-R, the distributed application runtime. But that's just one implementation of this idea of designing for portability. And Vasco, can you kick us off? What do you think of the idea of designing for portability and how is it being used today?
Well, from what I have seen, most of the usages of these tools and these patterns, they are going back, if I may say so, to the old paradigm of build once, run everywhere that we have been, hearing about for a long time, except that this time, instead of being on different machines, the everywhere is, every cloud, still chasing the vendor independence dream. And it is quite good to see that there are choices of frameworks to accomplish that goal. Personally, I believe that when the framework is good and has quite a reasonable amount of choices of platforms, it also means that whoever is designing and building the system can focus on what brings value instead of having to worry too much with the platform details that they are going to be running on.
And then one of the other ideas that kind of falls into this bucket, sometimes talked about, is WebAssembly. And there's also the clarification of client-side WebAssembly versus server-side WebAssembly. I know, Eran, this was something you called out earlier in our pre-discussion. Can you elaborate on that? What's the server-side WebAssembly integration with or thinking about for design for portability?
A lot of times when we think about WebAssembly, as we said, it's about running things in the browser. Like it's in the name, WebAssembly. But I think a large benefit of it is running it on the server side because there's an ongoing effort for integrating a WebAssembly-based, runtime instead of, let's say, Docker. Let's say you want to run in Kubernetes or another orchestrator, you want to run your software. Then instead of compiling it to a Docker container and then need to spin up an entire, system inside that container on your orchestrator, you compile it to WebAssembly. And that allows the container to be much more lightweight because it has security baked in, because it's meant to run in the browser, and it can run anywhere in any cloud on any CPU for that matter. So it doesn't matter if it's an ARM CPU or an x86 CPU. And basically just abstracts away all the details. So you don't really need to care about them. And it makes it everything work more lightweight in a more performant manner. I think that's the key benefit there that we'll see as we progress.
Daniel, I can see you nodding your head along. You have anything to add to that?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And as you mentioned, Aaron, like I can see the Docker folks leaning heavily into this as well, right? They've totally recognized exactly this. And I think there's a lot of interesting connections around security because as Vasco mentioned, I'm old enough to remember like Java, write once, debug everywhere was the phrase I think we often used to say, right? So I really like as the abstractions are going up through the chain, JVM to kind of like you sort of implied there, Vasco, that really we're at the kind of cloud abstraction layer now, right? I think things like Dapper combining with WASM, it's all about finding the right abstractions where we can get that reusability, right? That sort of high cohesion, low coupling for whatever level you're operating at. So many of us as architects are more thinking about the Dapper level stuff, right? But I think the WASM stuff really has an impact, and you hinted at it, Iran, on security, for example, right? If I choose to run like a super lightweight container, I'm sure many of us are using like Go and Scratch containers, same kind of deal, right? It gets rid of a whole attack vector potentially, right? I know we're going to look at software supply chain later on, but really I love the ideas of the different levels of abstraction here.
Yeah, I can't remember who said it one time. Every problem can be solved with one more layer of abstraction and indirection. But the idea behind that joke is I want to reduce the cognitive load. I don't want to have to think about the whole tech stack. How do I get closer to thinking about my business problem, my business logic, my domain? And if I have to think about how do I deploy this in Kubernetes all the time, that's one more thing that my developers have to think about. I think Dapper is one framework that says, hey, we're going to take care of all of the deployment problems. We know the shapes of the things we want to deploy, the things we want to build with. We've now given you the right size Lego bricks to build what you need. Tanma, you had an idea that I wanted to bring up that's, again, somewhat related. It was server-driven UI. Can you tell us more about what you think that is?
It's a concept that people started talking about a couple of years back, but then didn't really understand where to use those correctly. Any public applications that we see, any mobile native applications that all of us need to develop has to go through quite a lot of, let's say, scrutinies. When you get published on the app stores and the Google stores, you need to contest, and when you're in an era of, let's say, every day 100 production check-ins that you're making and continuous deployments, it's very hard to see that your code is not getting deployed unless somebody from Google and Apple is going to approve your applications, etc. Right? So I think that's where the benefit of server-driven UIs are kind of getting popular among quite a lot of cloud native, or let's say mobile native application developers, where they want to do server-driven UI development for native applications so that they can continue to improve their applications, not even bothering about if all of my users are on the latest versions, or do I need to kind of continue to keep the backups in general for the backward compatibilities as well, right? So that's where I see this trend kind of going to get kicked in again, and see a lot of those people will continue to follow on that route as well.
It's some of that cyclical nature of software that we tend to see these patterns going back and forth. Like we had mainframes that were very client server, and they're like, oh, well, now we can have the client be smarter. We can put the code over there and everything moves over. And then we got into the web era, and it's like, oh, the website does everything. And we just serve up simple HTML. And then HTML had all this JavaScript and all the app runs in the browser. So we keep going back and forth trying to find the right balance. And now we have a lot of options, and people can choose based on the latest technology, what's the right solution for you?
The very first time I mentioned this to somebody is like, isn't that something JSP used to do?
Nice. It's that cliche, right? Of like history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. But I think in software development, it's poetic, right? You just constantly see the same thing over and over again. And hopefully we make improvements, to your point, Thomas.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Just something to clarify that when we say design of portability, it's not necessarily about, as Daniel said, about writing once, running everywhere, because we were there before with Java and .NET and whatever. It's more about the fact that all the details are abstracted. You don't necessarily need to care about them, because let's say someone mentioned vendor lock-in, we want to avoid vendor lock-in. It's not about the fact that tomorrow we can take our entire application, move it to another cloud, it will still work, because it won't. There are always details that are abstracted away. If we change a database, we change the platform, something will break, something will need to change. It's more about the fact that we don't care about those details as we develop things. It makes it much easier for us as developers and as architects when we design our systems. And then later on, once need arises and we want to change something, we'll still need to work, but then it will be easier. But I think the focus is less about that and more about the abstraction side of things.
Yeah, I think portability is, like you said, not the I need to be able to move it, but it's I don't have to think about how it's anchored to the ground. My code is directly tied to this. And if you see the evolution of I used to write build scripts and it was an idea, let's have our infrastructure as code. Well, now we're a few layers abstracted from the infrastructure as code. I don't need to talk about deploy this VM. I just say I need some compute that does this. And we think about compute as the unit that I need, or I need some data storage. Just stick my data somewhere and handle it. And I'm further removed. And whatever's underneath that could vary. Like you said, if I deploy the same thing to AWS or Azure, maybe the underlying stuff is the same, but my abstraction looks identical.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a different perspective in that portability section as well, right? I mean, the industry that I kind of come into picture, I mean, quite a lot of companies, which are, let's say, national oil companies in general, they are very particular about where their data resides, and not the Googles and the Microsofts of the world are not available in every single region itself, as well, right? So building applications which are portable to run in every single data center, whether they are GCPs or the Azures or the AWS of the world, it's quite important as well. Same goes for the WebAssembly area as well. Imagine, let's say, all sort of applications, the Adobes and the Siemens of the world, when they used to build heavy desktop applications. And with the cloud, they had no answer about how do I provide this heavy desktop applications as a service to my customers. WebAssembly has been kind of coming to be a really true bliss in the sense, so that people are able to stream heavy applications via browsers itself as well, for sure.
Can I just put a pin as well? Like, so that I've heard a few folks say around Tame there, it's really all about the APIs, right? As in, because if we anchor ourselves to a vendor-specific API, it's really hard to move away. I think that's the secret of Dapper, if I'm being honest, right? It's all about the APIs, and they abstract without doing the lowest common denominator. I think that's one of the dangers, right? You always code to it's got to be MySQL or whatever, but I can't take advantage of Cloud Spanner or Redshift or whatever kind of thing. I think like the APIs are the key, and that's why I can see Dapper, if we can all collect around this CNCF project and go, hey, let's all agree exactly what Aran said, we're building for the future. It's still painful to change, but it's not impossible to change, right?
Absolutely, I agree.
So I want to move us on because otherwise we'll be talking about this for the entire afternoon. Large language models is, I think, the next thing I want to talk about. It seems lately there's a new product announcement. I think there were 3 this morning. Here's a new thing that just came out. GPT-3 is now old and GPT-4 is out. We've got ChatGPT, Bing, Bard. Who's going to be the best chatbot to talk to? And if you look at it, the people who are in the know have seen that we've been building to this slowly for years, but it seems like it's just suddenly got upon us in the last few months. Are we at some major inflection point? Is this all just hype, or is there something there that we really need to consider? That's my hot take. Who wants to take that and run with it?
I think I'm pretty excited about the advancement of all those applications from my personal space, but I'm equally worried about my enterprise architect hat as well, right? Because I'm not sure in terms of what sort of data is being used to train those models, etc. When I'm using it in my personal space, I'm very happy to use those applications. But when I start wearing my enterprise architect hat, I'm equally worried about what other challenges it's going to bring to my enterprise. If some of my developers are going to use ChatGPT to build applications and deploy that as well, right? So that's where I'm kind of very excited to see how this evolves as well, for sure.
Yeah, I think we're seeing kind of a revolution at the moment because while the ideas are not new, so GPT-3 has been around for a while and it's been used in various places, but we've seen like GPT-3.5 with ChatGPT and now GPT-4, and there are other models around. It's not the only one, but I think we're seeing large, like major improvements happening all the time, and like the speed and the velocity at which things happening just keeps getting faster. And I think we're at a point where the model is good enough. I mean, it's not perfect, there are always issues, but it's good enough to employ to various scenarios that we never thought of using it for before. So, for example, I see people at the company where I work, some of them like to hack things, and they use ChatGPT. They actually took one of our React components and they took our coding conventions of the company and they fed it into ChatGPT or GPT-4. They fed it with the coding convention. They fed it with the code for the React component. Go, what are the bugs here? What are we doing wrong? And it actually found things. And it's amazing. It actually found things that the developers never thought of. So that's only one way to try and utilize this new thing that we still don't know what we're going to do with exactly. But I think the possibilities are endless. And I'm, for one, I'm very excited for all the new things we're going to see around it, all the new APIs that will laid on top of ChatGPT, because ChatGPT and GPT-4, they're like very broad. You can just input some text, get some text back. But I think the innovation here, once it will be integrated as part of other systems using the API layers, and we'll adapt it like to specific fields, that's when I think we'll see like even more innovation coming.
I was hearing you speaking and also looking at the amount of products that have appeared in the past couple of weeks. It almost feels like we got ChatGPT, and then everybody else who was working on large language models looked at it and said, oh my God, we need to productize this. We are going to miss the train. And that's actually good because, in a sense, it feels like that we may be looking at the start of a new AI summer or AI spring, maybe, where the pressure of getting a product out there may actually produce something quite useful. And everybody's trying to see what the model can do. And well, I am indeed looking forward to what's coming out of it.
Perfectly said. And I'm a big fan of Simon Wardley. So Wardley mapping, if folks have bumped into it, and he talks about punctuated equilibrium, like a big disruptor, paradigm shift, exactly what you've all mentioned. And I like what you're saying, Vasco. One thing I'm sort of hearing around the productization, a lot of it's around the UX, right? And I'm sort of thinking back to, we mentioned Docker earlier on, like containers were not new, but Docker put a fantastic UX on them and a centralized repository, Docker Hub. That was a game changer, right? And I'm seeing, like, just to your point, Thomas, this morning, like there was a news drop on, I think it was like the GitHub, kind of what they're doing, and there's the voice control with ChatGPT and so forth. Like the UX is what it's about, right? Like we as developers would love to be able to chat to our sort of pair programmer or pair architect, right? And then get that feedback. But there's always that thing you mentioned, Tammay, of like, I kind of want feedback and input, but I want to make the choices. Because I remember when RPA, was it robotic process automation, came out, like UiPath, all that stuff. I remember going to a conference, an O'Reilly software architecture conference, and everyone was super nervous, quite rightly, about this. Because they were like, my finance team is creating this RPA thing. I've got no idea what security they put on it. I've got no idea what auth they're using, right? And I'm totally seeing that could be a potential with the output of these kind of frameworks now, right?
Yeah, I think it's you start opening it up from, professional developers are not always thinking about security, but the citizen developers really don't think about it because they assume it's just baked in because everyone picks up their iPhone and they think it's as secure as it needs to be. And they don't think about, what are the ramifications if I connect to this site and connect to that site? It's like, it's all fine, right? And then there's a breach and you find out, oh, this could have been maintained. When we lower the bar of who can write the code, and I think that's good in a lot of ways, we have to acknowledge we have to build better security by default and not so much that it prevents its use. That does kind of get to the idea of how is this one more way that I said citizen developers would use it, and how does it integrate with low code and no code? I think, Iran, this was your idea that you wanted to kind of tie in.
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk about low-code, no-code systems for a while. We've seen for years. It was on the InfoQ trends report. I don't remember when we added it, but it was there before. And I think that all of these language models are going to be a huge enabler for low-code, no-code systems. I remember a few days ago, I saw on Twitter, I don't remember who posted it, I saw an example of someone who integrated ChatGPT with the Unity platform, and they had like this prompt where you can say like, add 100 cubes, like add 3 sources of light. And it just did, because behind the scenes, it took the prompts, it translated them into code, and then it just ran them. And we also saw examples of how ChatGPT and now GPT-4 can actually create, usable code. And ChatGPT could only create, components, one file, etc. Simple things. GPT-4 is much more improved. You can actually generate entire, simple websites, but still. And I think once we take that, this could actually be a new abstraction of programming languages, because, we started from assembly and then we got C and C++, and then we got into all kinds of, Java and .NET and higher level languages. And I think you can think about this as a new programming language, which is much more abstract. And I don't know if you can do anything with it. Maybe not now, maybe it will come in the future. But I think it's inevitable that as citizen developers, but also as professional developers, much more efficient. And it's another tool that we can use, and we should learn how to utilize it.
Yeah, I think the example someone cited to me is a lot of people's first programming language is Microsoft Excel. They don't think about it.
And it's Turing complete.
But when you're saying this cell equals this plus that, or sum up these numbers, like you're writing code.
Yeah.
Like it's not just type in text. It is actual code there, and you don't think about it. Like, you don't think about it as programming, but in a sense, that's what you're doing. I see these large language models as that enabler that gives ordinary people the ability to do a lot more without having to know how it all works. And that's, again, that force multiplier of having an abstraction layer that's so powerful. I think someone pointed out it can create a full website. I saw the demo of, let me sketch out the website, take a picture, and then it generates the HTML for you.
Yeah, I saw that too.
Yeah. Wireframe.
Yeah, that goes to it's the UX that we need to figure out. If I can take a picture of something and get a working system, or I can talk to it, as opposed to I'm sitting there for an hour typing out code, that just saves me time. It's not doing anything that I couldn't do or some programmer couldn't do. It's doing the thing that's really easy so I can work on the thing that's really hard.
I think also a lot of people think, well, will this get developers, out of work? Will we need any more developers? And I think that's not the case. I think we'll still need developers. They'll just be more efficient and do more things, because I think Vasco mentioned earlier, we're still the one making the decisions. Because, for example, all these models are like GPT-3, I think, was already integrated in GitHub Copilot, for example, which I think was based on top of it, and could generate, test cases. And I assume at some point it will be updated to GPT-4 and will provide better results. But still, even when GPT-4 or other models, they generate code, you could still look at the code quality. It's not what we expect according to conventions. Maybe there's some hidden bugs in there that we don't know about, maybe some security flaws. And of course, with time, it will get better, it will get out better results, and we could go on faster. But I think we'll still be the drivers. It's just that the building blocks will be much bigger.
That's an interesting point, Aran. It does point to different skill sets we might need to learn as developers or architects, right? Because I think more product-minded developers will excel in this. To your point, Thomas, I sketch out a wireframe, happy days. But some folks really, and myself included, right, really like writing code. Sometimes I sort of want to write the code, right? So that's going to be really interesting, that thing we have to learn. And as architects, the way we phrase the problems, like typing is no longer the bottleneck by ourselves, by our teams. How's that going to change our jobs? Like quite a lot, I think, right?
Yeah. I think it's going to put Stack Overflow out of business before it puts me out.
Yeah, super interesting. Yeah.
But Stack Overflow is probably feeding half of what my questions are answered by. It's just saving me the work of finding the answer. So I wanted to move us on again. We don't talk about security a lot on the trends report, but I wanted to bring it up this year because it's been an interesting last few years with global supply chains being disrupted and the talk of the software supply chain and how that comes into play. Like, we're not moving molecules around, it's just electrons. But those bits that we're downloading for the hundreds or thousands of packages that my code depends on, we're now getting into this question of trust. How do I know what the code is that I'm using? Are we just trusting the commons that we've got? Oh, it's out on NPM or NuGet, so it's got to be safe. And how do we verify that the code I run is safe for what I need it to do?
Every time when anyone starts talking about the software supply chain security, a meme kind of pops up into my head where there's a bunch of great things that I've developed, and it says that it's based on a very tiny bit of JavaScript that somebody's maintaining some corner of the world that I'm not aware about, right? So I think that kind of says a lot about the supply chain software security. Starting from 2021, we started seeing quite a lot of buzz around that because there were some sort of incidents that proved us to make a conscious effort in that direction. I've seen quite a lot of, let's say, open frameworks that are available from Google's and the Microsofts of the world, where they are making it available for everyone so that, everyone start understanding what level of software supply chain security that you are into and what else can be done as well. So I think it's going to be quite evident as we continue to move ahead in this journey to keep stressing more and more on that for sure as well.
Something we might not be thinking about every day, but there needs to be something that the architects looking at the big picture of the system have to consider. What is the foundation that we're building on? Is it all just a house of cards 2 level down?
Getting visibility is a key thing there, Thomas. I think like a lot of working like say SBOMs, that kind of stuff, right? Like first thing is like knowing where there is a problem. And I think the Log4j stuff really triggered a lot of architects to realize like this is everywhere in my system. I didn't even realize there was Java running there. Do you know what I mean? So having that kind of SBOM, and you sort of mentioned like Salsa, Tame, has a bunch of frameworks popping up, right? Open source frameworks. Like I think they're super interesting. I definitely encourage architects to check these things out. Visibility is the first stage of the problem solving, right?
What about the idea of designing for sustainability? Vasco, I think you mentioned this a little bit. Are there new trends or new ways that people are thinking about making their software system sustainable or measuring it?
Indeed. I have noticed that there is more talk about sustainability these days. Let's be honest that probably half of it is because, well, energy is just more expensive and everybody wants to reduce OPEX. But it also means that there are new challenges. Let's look at a data center, for example. I am absolutely not an expert in data centers. I know they exist. I can understand them, but please don't ask me to optimize their footprint. Way out of my league. However, a data center is just at a level of abstraction that is just too high. And there are limits to what can be done to reduce the footprint at that level. Initiatives such as the Green Software Foundation, for example, that is part of the Linux Foundation, they are trying to come up with a methodology that people, developers, architects can use to measure the footprint of a software system. And that, depending on the boundaries that you choose, can actually allow you to measure the footprint of individual systems within a large boundary such as a data center. Going from there, well, the sky's the limit, I think.
Yeah, I think the measurement problem is the thing that we're working on most right now because we say we want to reduce our carbon footprint. What's my carbon footprint? And if you don't have a way to tell, the best guess we've had is, well, let me look at what my cloud spend costs because that's probably directly correlated to how much the servers are costing to run, which is based off the electricity. And let's assume the electricity is not green. But that's going to be wrong in a lot of cases. And it's going to be very different. If I deploy to US East, which runs mostly on coal, that's going to be different than a data center that runs on, renewable energy. So you have to factor that in. I think that's what the Green Software Foundation is trying to help do is not just what is your code doing, how much does it run, where is it, and how is it run?
Indeed. And also taking into consideration that the energy is cleaner at some points during the day and is dirtier at others as well. So that is still yet another factor.
So you can change when your software runs. Tanmay, you had something to add.
Well, yes, and I can relate more to that. I mean, I breathe in, breathe out all of these things every day as a part of my job, right? So for sure, I feel that the way we are talking about the software bill of material, we also going to start, seeing every single software provider is expected to provide their carbon emissions as a part of the services that they're providing, the way we provide reliabilities, the way we provide availabilities, etc., right? I feel that that's going to be a trend that we're going to see in the next few years for sure as well. And then what's going to drive that trend is the way that we do today our financial accounting as a public listed company. We're expected to do the carbon accountings as well sooner, right? So it's going to be quite evident that I may start choosing a vendor that does a greener energy emissions than the other one in some contexts as well, for sure. So it's going to be quite an interesting trend to watch out for sure.
I know a lot of companies, at least in the US, they said, oh, we've gone carbon neutral. Well, they just waited till 2020 happened and they sent everybody home and they stopped having, to pay for the electricity in their building. I'm like, are you counting everyone running at home and everyone's internet connection to connect back into the data centers? Ryan, did you have a last comment about this?
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier where the software is going to run and how it's going to operate, but it's also about when and how we time things. So, for example, today, and I think the key here is accountability. I think we start going into that because right now, as developers, we have like FinOps, running all the time, and it's getting more traction. And we're actually being measured on how much money we spend on the cloud because, a developer at his decision, her decision, they can just spin up a large instance and create like $10,000 bill, out of nowhere. But no one's measuring our emissions right now. And there isn't really a good way of doing it. Also, I know the large providers are working on all kinds of calculators to help you estimate your carbon footprint, but it's still not there and no one's holding us accountable for it. I think once we get to that stage where we'll be held accountable both as developers, but more importantly as architects, then we need to take those decisions into account. Because right now, like as an architect, I design a system, I'm well aware of how much containers am I using this database or that database because of cost. But when we factor in carbon emission and those calculations, I might decide, well, I can run this calculation at night, not because it's cheaper. It might be cheaper because, things like spot instances and stuff, but it also produces less emissions because of the way the power for that data center is generated and so on. So I think right now we're at the start of it. It's still an innovator's market, but I think it will progress as, accountability comes to mind when the calculators become better and it might even become a regulation thing, like who knows?
So I'm going to throw out a topic that I didn't mention earlier that I was going to bring up: blockchain and decentralized apps. Blockchain has sat on the innovator section of the trends graph, I think, since it showed up, and we haven't moved it because it is only applied to crypto and NFTs, and that just didn't seem interesting. Well, partially because Twitter was supposed to implode this year, Mastodon took off, and I think that's maybe the first time that people saw an actual decentralized app in production and they used it. Is that enough to say it's moved over to early adopter, or is blockchain and DApps still one of those innovator hasn't really caught on stages?
Shall I be controversial and say I still think it's niche or niche, depending on how you want to phrase it, right? I think there is something interesting there, but there's a lot of that's almost like a house of cards, right, built on top of it. In terms of it's very easy, we saw most of it, like Meta pulling back from NFTs, right? There's been all like the SVB Bank and like a lot of crypto stuff related to that as well. So I think there's like distrust in the market. When we had the zero interest rates, right, I think everyone was just like build all the things and clearly not think about carbon emissions and related to that as well, right? But now I think the fact that we do have like high interest rates and we are being more conscious of like some of these environmental factors, I don't see blockchain, particularly with like proof of work, I don't see it being a thing like proof of stake maybe, or some other things. But the way it's sort of originally architected, I don't see that happening in the current like macroeconomic climate.
Yeah, I think someone mentioned when we prepared for this podcast, someone mentioned that it just doesn't align with consumer demands or consumer requirements. Like you mentioned Mastodon earlier. Like it's decentralized, and as a techie, as a technologist, I really like it. I think it's cool. I think the way like a server shuts down, you can just move your stuff over and it continues working, and no one can shut it down, and there's no censorship in it. And these are very good ideas, but when you look at the average consumer, they really don't care about it. I just want it to work. Like I want to go to a certain website, type something in the browser, open an account, log in. Like I don't care if there's censorship or there isn't censorship. Like most people, again, some people who live in certain countries care about this very much. But I'm talking about like the most of the population that uses this tech. And decentralized software is still not there. It still doesn't offer. I think the only case that I can think of that a decentralized app was actually successful was around file sharing and torrents and stuff like that. And the reason why that was successful because the consumer requirement actually aligns with the nature of decentralized app. I don't want to get caught. I don't want anyone to be able to block me. And I want it to work fast. So decentralized allows doing it much better. So the requirements aligned with the technology there, but I don't think there's another case of that was very successful.
I think you hit it on the head. There's no consumer need for that as a top level feature. And so why add the complexity if we don't need it? So I wanted to wrap up the discussion kind of talking about the socio-technical issues, the ways that architects are working. I think we took it off the trend chart last year, but the architect is technical leader, the what role do you have as an architect? How do you lead? And also, how are we doing with remote and hybrid work? All of that kind of stuff about how are we doing architecture? Just general thoughts that people have on that concept. Vasco, you want to kick that off?
Well, I can get started by sharing my personal view, which is that regardless of whether we are designing a piece of software or an enterprise architecture at a 30,000 feet view, it is always important to, and this sounds like a cliche, but not to lose touch with reality. And that is when expressions such as having one foot in the engine room or always messing around with tech, even if you don't write code or build a system on your free time, just ensuring that there are still lines of communication open with the people who are actually building and troubleshooting and debugging and involved in those calls at 3 o'clock in the morning. That is the only way how we can really understand whether what we are designing works and has value, and then take those lessons to the next project. That's my take on it. Yeah.
Tanmay?
I kind of know, like the idea always about, documenting your architecture, right? If you just Google around the word, how do I document an architecture? And there's not really good answers or a very strict or very popular answers to that, right? And then I always get that question with some of the junior people that I'm kind of currently working with, right? And there are quite a lot of good things available, right? People generally start talking about ADRs, but then they only record the decisions part itself, right? I'm not going to give the full view of architecture how it is there right now, right? So I'm kind of, right now struggling to have a very good standard around that part. The way I personally try to use it is obviously with a combination of C4, ADR, and something like ARC42 is the way for me is the correct answer so far for me right now, right? So, but then I certainly feel that there has to be something revolutionary to happen, considering the fact that software architecture is such a old in the sense that an age-old kind of practice that we have been practicing all across, and there's still no good answer to document a very good software architecture in the sense, right?
Yeah, can I just add like great answers already? But I think particularly like coming almost full circle with like LLMs and like ChatGPT, the what now is going to be easier. We can feed stuff into like our systems and go like, what's going on there, and like it'll spit back and we can have a conversation. As you alluded to, Tame, the why is not going to be there, right? And that's ADRs. And Thomas, you've talked fantastic on previous podcasts around the value of ADRs. But I almost envision like talking about UX again, right? But the ability to scrub the timeline. Do you know what I mean? Like I do it sometimes in Google Docs and things. And like, why did we get to this point? And I can go back in the version history, Git, Google Docs, choose your poison, right? But I think the why is going to be the real thing. The what, like ChatGPT is just going to rock that better than we can. Feed the code in, give us an answer. But like, why? Because it's always good intentions, good information at the right time, but then imperfect world, right? And you're like, what idiot put this code there? Oh, it was me 2 years ago, is the classic, right? And I love to be able to scrub that timeline and go, why did I do it at the time? Oh, these constraints were there, which have changed now. I can make different decisions, right?
Daniel, you just blown my mind. As we were talking, I started thinking, well, if we'll feed ChatGPT, we'll give it our code, and we also provided our ADRs along with it, and they'll all be timed, and like it will have access to the Git commit history. I can ask some complex questions around why we've done some stuff and who's at fault at something. Like that's an interesting custom. I wonder who's going to turn it into a product.
We need to patent this, right? I think like this, the five of us here, right, could make some serious money, right?
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah, I want the GPT-enabled forensic auditor that comes in and says,
yeah.
what did it look like at this time and why did you do it that way on December of 2022? I don't remember, but all the data should be there if you had it captured. I personally have found that if I am writing an ADR using ChatGPT or Bing to ask it the questions, help me understand the trade-offs. That's a surprising thing that a year ago I would not have considered, having that as my like virtual assistant, my pair programming assistant. Like, I work in a different time zone than most of my team, so they're not always on when I'm working late. And having that person that's always available to ask a question. And then if I get lazy, please just write the ADR for me. And then I compare it to what I would have done. And so that's a new way of working that I think gets to, we have to constantly be looking as architects of what the new technology trends are. How can we incorporate them? Should we incorporate them? And how can we make our process better? And how can we get that to our developers and engineers and everyone else we work with and make their lives better?
I think the old remote world, right? I mean, the word about asynchronous communication kind of is the key always, right? And ADRs and C4s or all those things that we keep talking about are the best means to communicate your architecture if you're working in a remote setup for sure as well. These are the tools probably for doing great asynchronous communications also.
So I want to thank everybody for joining me and participating in this discussion of architecture and design trends for the InfoQ Trends Report. We hope you'll enjoy this, and please go to the InfoQ.com site and download the report that'll be available the same day this podcast comes out. So thank you again, Vasco Veloso, Orion Stiller, Tanmay Deshpande, and Daniel Bryant. I hope you join us again soon for another episode of the InfoQ podcast.